Hello and welcome to the Society of Professional Journalism podcast here at LMU. I'm your host, Sam Beck. On this episode, we're going to talk about a number of subjects within the realm of domestic law enforcement in the 21st century, including the LA Sheriff's Department, police transparency and oversight, the phenomenon of police gangs, civil rights and criminal justice, and the future of policing in America. We have a very special guest on the podcast today, a veteran federal civil rights prosecutor, Dr. Michael Gennaco. Welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's good to see you. Thanks, Sam.
So for people who might not know who Dr. Michael Gennaco is, can you tell me briefly about your background? I mentioned that you are a federal civil rights prosecutor. But if you could talk about where you got your degrees and your career linearly, just briefly.
Sure. The older I get, the longer this takes, but I'll try to give you the 50,000-foot version. I went to undergraduate school at Dartmouth College, graduated, taught school as an educator for a few years, and then I went to law school, graduated from Stanford. And then I was hired and worked for a judge for a year, and then I was hired into the honors program in the Civil Rights Division. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., had cases all over the country. I started first in the voting section doing voting discrimination cases, and then moved over to do criminal investigations and prosecutions most of the time that I was there. I was there about 10 years. The work in the criminal section of the Civil Rights Division broke down into three areas, one being hate crimes, federal hate crimes, the other being modern-day slavery and human trafficking, and then the third was official misconduct, excessive force, false imprisonment, and any other Fourth or Fifth Amendment violations that rose to the level of criminal activity. I then moved to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, did that same work for another 7 years. And then most recently, for the past 21 years, I've been involved in the field of police oversight.
It's an extremely impressive and illustrious career. Those first three that you mentioned you worked for a judge, but then you went into, so you said the first was hate crimes, the second was civil rights and human trafficking, slavery.
Right, modern-day slavery. So actually when I moved to Los Angeles and worked in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we had one of the biggest slavery cases in history. There were 50-some, mostly women, not entirely, that were forced to come here to Los Angeles and sew garments against their will, and were essentially held captive for a number of years.
That's horrific. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what that case looked like? Where did they come from?
They were brought here from Thailand. They were recruited in the poorest parts of Southeast Asia, promised that if they were to come to America, they would be able to make a lot of money, be able to give money back to their family, send money back to their family. And so they were brought here, picked up at LAX, and once they came to Los Angeles, they were picked up by a van, put into a condominium in El Monte, condominium complex in El Monte, which had been essentially converted into a prison. The captors, the traffickers, for example, reversed the locks, so you needed a key to get out instead of a key to get in. And they were essentially forced to work 6-7 days a week, on average of 15 or 16 hours a day, sewing garments for the fashion industry here in Los Angeles.
Wow. Was this for a company, a name brand?
It was a number of companies, and once we were able to liberate them and they gained their freedom, in addition to prosecuting the traffickers, they filed lawsuits, meaning the workers, filed lawsuits against a number of brands that had been using this company for their garment making.
Wow, that is horrific. Were there a lot of cases like this? Was this a frequent thing in your time?
There probably was quite frequent, but at that time there wasn't a lot of training with regard to identifying human trafficking. As a result of this case and a couple of others, a lot more attention, a lot more training, a lot more resources have been dedicated to ferreting out these types of activities. We had a number of cases out of that weren't as large as this one, but other cases in which individuals were forced to come to America and work in domestic work or in sex trade and other areas, but they were not free to go, and they were essentially being held captive.
Yeah, because this is something that's gaining a lot of media traction and attention lately, and I feel as though the public has become more aware of, especially with the whole case of Jeffrey Epstein and that whole scandal. Was there anything? 50 people, that's like a large scale operation.
Yep.
So were most of the crimes that you were dealing with that you were prosecuting at this time, were they at that level? Were they at that pay grade, more or less?
With regard to quantity, no.
Or just level of sort of like the visceral nature, kind of just how shocking?
They were all shocking. And, for example, the domestic case I talked about involved the wife of the Thai ambassador, essentially bringing over servants and holding them to do a domestic work against their will. They weren't free to leave.
Unbelievable. Yeah, the public becoming more aware of things like this is extremely important, because I have no idea that something like that could even be going on sort of just in broad daylight without, especially here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
That's sort of hard to believe.
Yeah.
So the first was hate crimes. The second was human trafficking and modern day slavery. The third was...
The third was the police misconduct, official misconduct. It wasn't exclusive to police, although it was usually police, law enforcement that were in the crucible of these cases. But we also, could and did prosecute judges for violating constitutional rights in one case, and others involved in the criminal justice system, prison guards, for example.
Any notable cases?
I think they were all notable. The one involving the judge was a judge who essentially forced a defendant that he had a case with to have sex with him in exchange for leniency. Those are just, we had a number of cases involving LAPD, LA sheriffs, in which excessive force was used, and they were prosecuted for using excessive force, making false reports. But they all were pretty significant cases.
So at what point do you end up in your career? Do you end up at the Sheriff's Department, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department?
Yeah, after doing work with the Civil Rights Division for about 15 years, all told, or Department of Justice, all told, this opportunity became available to start a new oversight group for the Sheriff's Department in LA County. I was encouraged to apply for the position. I did, and the County Board of Supervisors selected me as the first chief attorney for the Office of Independent Review, which was an oversight entity over the Sheriff's Department.
So for people, I'm realizing as I've talked to more and more people about this, there are certain people who think there are just police in Los Angeles or any county. They might not even know the difference between a police officer and a sheriff. And then furthermore, I admit I'm even one of these people. I almost don't understand the depth of the sheriff's department and how complicated and massive of an organization it is. It's the largest sheriff's agency in the world. Can you explain in layman's terms maybe the different branches of the organization and the kinds of things that might make sheriffs different than police?
There's a lot of overlap between the responsibilities of a police officer and a deputy sheriff on patrol. But the sheriff's department, in addition to having patrol responsibilities in the unincorporated area of a county, so there's a lot of land in LA County that is, most of LA County is incorporated, but there are still parts of LA County that do not belong to a city. There's no city associated with it. And in those areas, it redounds to the sheriffs to be responsible for providing public safety to people who live in those unincorporated areas.
Right.
There are also 40 independent cities in LA County that don't have their own police department, but they contract for public safety services with LA County sheriffs. So that talks about their patrol function. But they've also got a responsibility under state law for maintaining the safety and security of inmates housed in the county jails.
Right. So they oversee highly populated areas, East LA, Altadena, and it has contracts with certain cities like Compton, Lancaster,
That's correct.
Antelope Valley. Would it be correct? So it would not be correct then to assume that these cities need the presence of the sheriffs because they're typically associated with higher crime rates, or is it what necessitates their presence?
It has little to do with crime rates. It just is a decision a city makes. Do we want to fund our own standalone police department, or do we just want to contract with the sheriff for providing these police services? And there are arguments and pros and cons to either. Some of the contract cities have high crime rates, like
Compton, for instance.
Like Compton, and others don't, like Malibu, Lost Hills. They don't have their own police department. They're in contract with the sheriff's department.
And you mentioned that they oversee the jail system as well, the Los Angeles jail system.
Correct.
They work in the courts as bailiffs, and they work in the jails as guards.
Yes.
Are all of those sworn officers, or some of them civilian? And is there a difference?
There is a difference. In patrol, most of the patrol responsibilities are done by sworn deputies. In the courts, most of the court security is provided by deputies, although some of the positions are not sworn, like the maintaining of the metal detectors to come into the courthouse. I think those are unsworn positions usually. In the jail, it's about majority, I think, are still sworn deputies, but they have a classification called custody assistants, which work in the jail, but they are not sworn officers. Understood.
So the position opens in the LASD. There's a contract that opens. You apply for the contract.
Yeah.
In our previous conversation, we might have mentioned it was something to do with the Rampart scandal that necessitated this contract even opening in the first place.
I wouldn't say it necessitated the contract. What I would say is that the sheriff at the time was inspired by what was going on with LAPD and Rampart. So what his thinking at the time was, we probably will have a scandal, coming up at some point, and I'd rather have some oversight in place before we have a scandal. to hopefully prevent it, or at least be able to respond to it once the scandal broke.
Right. So it was proactive. Could you explain to people who don't know what Rampart is briefly, in your words, what the Rampart scandal was?
The Rampart scandal involved a number of officers from a specialized unit who were assigned to focus on gangs and drugs and guns in the Rampart area. Their acronym was called CRASH. And as it turned out, their mission went awry in the sense that they began to cross the line and abused individuals, subjects, through excessive force, stole their money, stole their drugs, and just essentially were those who were entrusted to enforce the law began to regularly break the law.
So this was when the OIR got created.
Yeah.
The idea for the OIR got created.
I think that was one of the inspirations for why the sheriff at the time agreed to have oversight.
Because the OIR is technically you founded it, correct?
I was the first person chosen to fill the position. The OIR, the name of the OIR came from the county.
Okay.
But I filled the position for 13 years, yeah.
Understood. So what exactly was the function of the OIR?
We were asked to essentially take a look at the accountability aspects of the Sheriff's Department, internal investigations, uses of force, and do our best to make sure that when an allegation or complaint came in, that it was fairly and thoroughly investigated, and that an appropriate result was reached with regard to accountability.
Were there things that you couldn't do in that field? Was there, you as an independent entity, what was the limit of, would you say there was a limit of your operational jurisdiction?
We got access to any information we wanted or needed to do our job. There were structural limits in the sense that we weren't designed to conduct our own investigations. We didn't have prosecutive authority. But that's, usually true for oversight.
Right. So now there's the OIG and the COC in the Sheriff's Department. For people who don't know, what are those bodies, and how was the OIR similar and different to those current entities?
The COC is a civilian oversight commission appointed, by board members to examine certain aspects of the Sheriff's Department. Those individuals, while some of them are professional and highly qualified in their fields, they don't really have a whole lot of expertise in oversight or police practices. They're a civilian entity. The OIG consists of individuals who do have more expertise in police practices, and to some degree they are intended to function like we did. There are some limits that were placed on the work they do that were not placed on the work we do, or we did. One best example is they did not get involved in making recommendations regarding accountability or discipline.
In the last administration, there was a lot of drama over the lack of leverage that the oversight bodies had on the sheriff, as exposed by Villanueva. From your perspective, what problems existed, and were there solutions that could have been implemented?
It's hard to know what problems existed because once Villanueva came on board, he virtually shut down pretty much all the access to information that the Inspector General had been getting from the previous sheriff. And that if you don't have information, you can't even begin to try to figure out or identify problems. So that, I think, was the biggest stumbling block. The sheriff went so far as to initiate 2 criminal investigations into the head of OIG, other criminal investigations into members of the commission, and former colleagues of mine.
Could we possibly look at your time in the LASD for certain answers to those issues? How did your relationship and the dynamic between you and the sheriff at the time differ?
I think we were able to be more impactful with regard to individual cases and ensuring that they were thoroughly investigated and that the right result was reached. I think as a result of having an objective set of eyes and ears on the cases and making recommendations on outcomes, we were able to ensure that people who had committed violations of policy that were so severe that they deserved to lose their peace officer authority and needed to be separated from the department. And I think as a result of us being on board, that a number of deputies lost their jobs that may not have lost their jobs if we hadn't been part of the process.
Is there anything specifically that you credit that ability to? Was it just the competency of the OIR itself or the people involved? Was it some kind of policy legislation? Was it just the time and the way that or was it the sheriff? Is it hard to say?
Well, we generally had the sheriff's backing or support with regard to the influence that we had on the department. Ultimately, the decision on accountability or discipline rests with the department, but I think we were able to use our powers of persuasion, our review of the cases, our knowledge of the transgressions in a way in which command staff who might want to give a deputy a break or give the deputy another chance would recognize that in the long run is not the appropriate thing to do as a result of the conversations we had.
Mm. So which administration specifically did you work in?
Most of the time that we were there, we were working with Sheriff Baca. When he retired, we ended up working with the interim sheriff for a little bit, Sheriff Scott.
So you say the word retired, which can you talk to me about your experience of the Baca administration?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that, during the time that he was the sheriff, that he was very supportive of our work, that he was deferential to our work, that he listened to us, that we had access to him, that if we had a disagreement with somebody in his chain of command, that we could bring the disagreement to him. And he would, I think, most of the time end up siding with us.
Can you explain the lawsuit, the Baca and Tanaka lawsuit, for people who don't know? What was the original complaint? How did the case unfold, etc.?
There are a couple of 3 lawsuits that still exist. One of them, I think, predated Baca.
Okay.
So it was all the way back to Sherman Block.
So he inherited some.
He inherited some. But, one involved conditions in the jail brought by the ACLU back in the 90s. Another involved some concerns about enforcement activity in the Antelope Valley. And then I think there was also a disability access lawsuit that probably is still going on with regard to the jails not being designed in a way where folks who are disabled are able to move around very easily.
Mm. Were there any out of those three that were more benign than the last? It sounds like the first one, there wasn't anything that he could theoretically do about it. The second one, it sounds like, I'm not familiar with the Antelope Valley case. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate briefly on that?
Antelope Valley focused on the way in which deputies were enforcing Section 8 housing situation.
Understood.
And whether they were doing that fairly. And a DOJ investigation found that there were some problems, and so they are trying to resolve that.
Understood.
The conditions of confinement go everything from overcrowding to just the basic conditions of the jail, excessive force allegations, and a number of other concerns.
When you look up what happened on the internet about Baca and Tanaka, the internet reads that there was a situation in which there was an inmate that was either coerced or hidden from investigation, an ongoing investigation, that there was an obstruction of justice. That's what the internet says when I look it up. Is that, would you say that's accurate? Is that still?
The case largely involved an inmate who had agreed to be an informant for the FBI. The FBI provided the informant a cell phone, smuggled a cell phone into the jail for the inmate. The cell phone was discovered by the sheriff's department, and an investigation then was conducted by the sheriff's department, and that mostly involved interviewing the inmate to learn, what he might have with regard to allegations of misconduct. The FBI alleged that when they were looking for the inmate, the sheriff's department did not provide them ready access to the inmate, at least not right away. And that was part of the case that was brought then against a number of individuals for obstruction. It went to court, and a number of individuals were convicted of that obstruction allegation.
I would imagine it was tough to even be a contracted appendage of that organization during all of that. Was the OIR forced to bear witness to any of that misconduct, or did you ever experience anything extraordinary from LASD executives during that time, or anybody that you were working with?
The acts that led to the eventual convictions occurred while we were still at OIR. We were not directly involved in any of them. And the subsequent prosecution didn't begin until after our contract had ended. So by that time, I was no longer with OIR, although I was called both as a prosecution witness and as a defense witness in the various cases that came out of that allegation, that indictment.
So moving sort of away from that, well, there's been a lot of attention on the phenomenon of police gangs,
mm-hmm.
Specifically within the deputies of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department.
Mm-hmm.
From your perspective, what is a deputy gang?
A deputy gang would be, and it's kind of defined in a statute that was passed by the state legislature in the past couple years. And under that definition, it would be on-duty conduct by deputies that were in violation of policy or constitutional law. Deputies who have a common objective of abusing the Constitution, and that's sometimes symbolized by getting similar tattoos, developing creeds that run contrary to the ethos, guidelines, policies, and expectations of the organization.
Why do you think groups like this might form? Or why would a new deputy be enticed to join one of these gangs in the first place? What's the appeal? Do they make extra money?
Don't make extra money. I think a lot of it's peer pressure. A lot of it is trying to fit in with certain deputies who are considered to be leaders or hard workers, productive. I think that the us versus them mentality with regard to we are the warriors and we need to protect the public from this bad element. You develop an we versus them mentality. And when you have a we versus them mentality, it adds to your cohesion, but then it alienates those that, are on the other side. And I think it dehumanizes them in some ways.
Do you know how they recruit?
All kinds of ways. I think the solicitation to belong to these groups oftentimes begins when the newer deputies are in the jails. Every deputy for a few years have to work in the jails, and then they get to go out to patrol at some point. And some of the stations that have had a history of deputy cliques or gangs would often recruit from the jails and encourage deputies to apply to their stations.
What kinds of different gangs, or how many different gangs did you become aware of during your time at the LASD, if any?
Oh, there were probably a dozen, but or so, extending for 20, 30 years into the past. So this is not a new phenomenon.
What did their activity look like? You mentioned it started in the jails. There are multiple gangs, names floating around that are specifically associated with Men's Central Jail.
There wasn't a lot of evidence of deputies belonging to gangs while assigned to the jail. The best evidence involves deputies who are working in a station assignment in patrol. Clearly, some things are unrefuted, which is oftentimes deputies would call themselves a name.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes deputies would get common tattoos.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes deputies would develop unofficial bylaws on how they should conduct themselves in the field. And sometimes those bylaws ran against, as I said, the expectations and policies and directives of the department. We had a case when we were there in which a group actually developed a very crude sort of code of conduct. And if you read the code of conduct, there were some things that were stated that are seriously problematic. One thing we couldn't prove is whether that was ever actionable or actually put into action in the field. It may have been aspirational more than real But the mere fact that they were thinking about doing what they were doing was seriously problematic.
Are you allowed to disclose what they...
Well, one, for example, is that they developed this symbols that if you were involved in a deputy-involved shooting, you got to change your tattoo a little bit. And that would suggest that it was a badge of honor to be involved in a deadly force incident, which is not what you want. They were very... they excluded others from who wanted to join, the group. And there was just some language that, if in fact it was carried out, it would have, if they carried out the creed, it would have been significantly problematic. As we did the investigation, we tried to find incidents that that would be evidence that they were carrying out this rogue sort of mentality, but the evidence really wasn't there. So I don't know how much of it was just talk, as bad it was, versus how much was actually happening.
Specifically in that case, you mean with the sort of code of conduct?
Yes. That being said, those who were, who identified as being in that group, serious discipline and separation occurred in those cases, so they were no longer working for the sheriff's department.
Understood. When I think of reasons that cliques like this might form, I think of the dynamic between the areas of LA that these deputies inhabit and patrol. Mm-hmm. Jails obviously being highly connected to the streets. Is there a relationship between deputy gangs and street gangs?
There are some similarities, although they, are vastly different in what their missions are, in my view. A lot of the deputies who belong to the cliques are doing work on gang enforcement. So they see the street gangs as, the bad guys.
I guess what I'm getting at, so do you think the metastasizing issue, the gang issue on the streets of Los Angeles, encouraged a co-formation of deputy gangs? In other words, we know how bad the gang issue is in LA. Mm-hmm. From your view, is the deputy gang issue bad enough to assert that there might be some kind of mutually causal relationship between the two? And I'm just thinking about Rampart when I say this. Is this a way for police to go above the law, to violate policy and, like, quote, get things done when playing by the rules isn't working?
In their perception, it's not working. I'm not sure that the perception is grounded in reality. But yeah, I do think that those who are involved in dealing with the criminal element in the street gangs will potentially develop an us versus them mentality, which means they will try to become more cohesive as a group, which in and of itself isn't a problem, but what is the problem is where that group's way of doing business conflicts with the Constitution, laws, policy, expectations of the leadership of the agency. And there were some suggestions that at times there was that divergence, which is problematic.
You mentioned this us versus them mentality. Well, we know in this situation who us is. It would be these cliques, but them and defining them is, I suppose, what I'm trying to do. The media narrative about these gangs is that of being outwardly violent towards civilians, as targeting minority communities. And there are multiple lawsuits and testimonies, one of which I attended, which is where I actually first saw you at the Loyola Law School. Mm-hmm. It was a citizen testimony that, backs this claim. These communities where this activity is occurring seem to have become victims in this war for power and control in LA, a war that has been going on for a long time that, we have not always been able to see. would you agree that there are perspectives of this story that the general public has not seen yet?
I think that more needs to be examined, and I also think that more work needs to be done by the agency and others to ensure that, to the degree that deputies are forming cohesive groups, that those groups do not get into a situation where they run afoul of the expectations, where they start to cut corners, where they start to harass individuals who are purported gang members, and where they don't treat people, the way that deputies are expected to treat people.
Right.
Fairly.
You have a background in civil rights, and I would imagine that there's this blurring of the lines between, criminal and just somebody who lives in a community sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to figure out if these cliques are really just thugs or if they're actually trying to wage war against street criminals who are trying to also leverage power in the community, or if they're just trying to bulldoze these communities themselves. It's tough for me to tell.
Yeah. Let me put it this way: those who are doing traditional enforcement on the streets involving criminal street gangs or the criminal element are focusing on those individuals or people they believe are doing that.
Right, of course.
Not the moms and children and others that are doing that. That being said, if they're not focused and supervised and kept on the straight and narrow, there is a tendency to then start to cut corners, to rouse people without probable cause, to stop people without reasonable suspicion, to arrest people that you don't really have the evidence to substantiate an arrest. And that's where things get problematic. You use the term wage war, and they use that term all the time. That term doesn't work in America. You shouldn't be waging war against whoever. The worst, the baddest of the bad are still entitled to their 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th Amendment rights, and the whole concept of we're in a war, I think, is just that terminology is a problem. You're there to enforce the law. You're there to enforce the law, not to wage war.
Yeah.
That's for the military.
Yeah, not on our home soil.
And to be fair, to be fair to the deputies, unfortunately that terminology is used by politicians and leaders throughout the country. There's a war on this, a war on that, a war on drugs,
right.
And I push back on that terminology.
Have you seen this phenomenon in any organizations other than the LASD?
I think the commonality, the idea of getting tattoos exists in other law enforcement agencies and other walks of life. I mean,
of course,
college fraternities often get common tattoos. Yale, George Bush had a bulldog on his butt tattoo, and as a member of secret society. So this has been, military platoons are often getting common tattoos.
Of course, yeah.
I don't think that in and of itself is the problem, but the problem is when that group starts going off on its own and developing its own rules of engagement. And that happens in the military. We've seen that.
When your contract with the LA Sheriff's Department expired, you wrote an address to the department that is still on the LASD website, predicting exactly what would happen with this last administration. I don't know if you meant to do that. It was damn near clairvoyant. And I mean, you predicted the exact abuses of power that have made certain executives in the last administration infamous. What motivated you to write that letter or the address?
The memo that I wrote was what appeared to be an interest in a retrenchment with regard to some of the responsibilities that we had, and most notably creating the IG and taking them out of individual case reviews, taking them out of having a voice in outcome of the case, in discipline. And I just thought that was wrong-headed. I still think it's wrong-headed, and I think that that oversight structure has suffered as a result of not being involved in that. I think they are missing a big piece of accountability, which is having an outside entity have a voice in what should happen once the violation has been determined.
Right. And so to not necessarily have, like you said, the OIR didn't have the ability to prosecute, but you did have an ability to, what was that distinction that you're sort of mentioning?
Yeah. Before the decision was made about what to do with a deputy who had violated policy, we were able to go to the decision maker and give our views on what should happen. 5-day suspension, written reprimand, demotion, 60-day, 30-day suspension, or separation. We were able to make those recommendations. And as I said earlier, the department did not have to agree or did not have to go along, but they tended to do that. One, because I think what we were saying was persuasive, but also if there was a disagreement, we had ultimately it was their call, but then we could write about it publicly, and we did. And so in cases in which we thought a deputy should have been fired and he wasn't because somebody gave him a break, we'd write that. And I think that was incentive for the executives to listen to us.
Were you ready to move on after that project? I would imagine that after a massive project like that, finding your next, where to pivot was exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it was time. 13 years is a long time to be doing one thing, and I think it was good. And since that time, the past 8 years, we've been able to do a lot more work with a lot more different agencies. There, we were tied down to one large agency, and now we are probably involved in 15 to 20 agencies at any one time.
Yeah, which brings me to present. So currently you are involved in
probably 20 projects involving 20 different agencies, some of them ongoing, some of them just coming in and out. So for example, we just finished a project for Santa Barbara. It was an in and out, but Palo Alto or Portland, Oregon, or...
Under which agency? The name is...
Pardon me?
The entity you're currently working on.
It's called OIR Group. Yep.
So still sort of the same name, correct?
Sort of the name, but it was a county name, so we just changed it a little bit to OIR Group.
Yeah. So you're doing 20 different projects?
Approximately. I don't have an exact number.
And it's not just California?
No.
Yeah.
Mostly California, but not entirely so.
You mentioned New York as well?
Doing some work in New York, Chicago. We have done work in Madison, Wisconsin. We're doing work in Boulder, Colorado currently. So, yeah.
Would you ever go back to the sheriff's department?
No. I don't think so. I mean, if they could ever, if there was a time when they had a discrete project and they could use my help, I would think about it if we had the bandwidth to do it. But
Sure.
We're plenty busy right now.
Yeah. I feel like the story of the OIR Group is so relevant to now in a larger narrative that's related to oversight and management of policing in America, responsive policing. I hear about programs that are just now on the rise, like ABLE training. I think you mentioned you've heard of that as well.
I have. Mm-hmm.
That's leaning more and more towards a healthy dynamic between, on all sides of law enforcement. And the OIR has surely been one of them that paved the way and is still doing so. The OIR Group. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on.
No, we really appreciate your interest in the topic, and
I'm so fascinated with you guys specifically. I began to research the history of, and I found you guys, and especially when I saw your testimony at Loyola Law School, I was like, I need to talk to this man and find out what his story is, because I could just tell it's not difficult to tell when somebody has played like a critical role, or when somebody has a perspective that is of high interest.
Well, the way in which policing does their work in America is something that's really important, and it's going to help define our relationship, public safety performance. Is key to civilization and keeping us going. But when we give individuals the awesome power that we give police, that power must be carefully checked, and oversight is one way of doing that.
Agreed. Dr. Gennaco, thank you so much.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Great to see you too. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for watching the SPJ LMU podcast. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and tune in for the next episode.